There's a moment in the Gospel of John that everyone reads, but almost no one truly sees. It happens right before Lazarus walks out of his tomb, still wrapped in burial cloths, still carrying the smell of death. Jesus stands at the entrance of the cave. The crowd is weeping. Martha has just told him it's too late. Her brother has been dead for 4 days. The body is already decomposing. And then Jesus does something strange. He doesn't immediately command. He doesn't launch into prayer. He doesn't close his eyes and start asking God for help. Instead, he becomes utterly still. The Gospel says he lifted up his eyes, but it doesn't tell you what happened in that lifting. It doesn't describe the doorway he walked through in those silent seconds. It doesn't name the inner shift that occurred before a single word left his mouth. And then he speaks. Not as a request, not as a question. He says, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me." Past tense, already done. Before Lazarus moves, before the miracle manifests, before there's any physical evidence that death has been reversed, Jesus thanks God as though it's already finished. Now, if you've been taught that prayer is about asking God to change his mind, that sentence makes absolutely no sense. You don't thank someone in past tense for something that hasn't happened yet. You don't speak as though the future is already the present unless you've gone somewhere else, unless you've entered a state where time bends, where the separation between what is and what will be has dissolved completely. That's exactly what Jesus did. He entered, and this is the part they never taught you. The part that was deliberately removed from your understanding of prayer, not because it was false, but because it was too powerful to give away freely. What I'm about to show you isn't speculation. It's not metaphor. It's pattern. It's method. And once you see it, you'll never read the Gospels the same way again. But I need to warn you, this isn't for everyone. If you're here because you want someone to confirm what you already believe, if you need your faith to stay comfortable and familiar, you should probably stop watching now. Because what I'm about to reveal will unsettle everything you were taught about how prayer works. It will challenge the very foundation of what you think Christianity is. But if you've always sensed that something was missing, if you've felt like you're repeating scripts that don't carry the weight they once did, if you've wondered why your prayers feel like they're hitting a ceiling while Jesus' prayers shattered reality itself, then you're exactly where you need to be. Because the method Jesus used, the actual technique that turned ordinary words into world-changing power, is still accessible. It was never destroyed. It was just hidden, moved out of public teaching and into the hands of the few who were deemed ready to handle it. And now, you're about to remember what you've always known. Let's start with what you were given, because you need to see it clearly before you can release it. From the time you were young, whether in Sunday school or catechism or youth group, you were taught a very specific model of prayer. You were told that prayer is conversation with God, that it's talking to Him, bringing your requests before Him, confessing your sins, thanking Him for blessings, maybe even bargaining with Him when things got desperate enough. You learned to bow your head, to fold your hands, to close your eyes and speak into the silence, hoping, always hoping, that someone was listening on the other side. You were taught that if you prayed with enough sincerity, enough faith, enough humility, then maybe, just maybe, God would answer. Maybe He'd heal your sick parent. Maybe He'd provide the money you needed. Maybe He'd intervene in that impossible situation. But only if it was His will. Only if the timing was right. Only if you'd earned it somehow through your faithfulness. And so you prayed. You prayed hard, you prayed long. You prayed with tears streaming down your face, with your heart breaking open, with every ounce of desperation you could summon. And sometimes things happened. Sometimes the answer came. Sometimes the breakthrough arrived. And when it did, you praised God. You thanked Him. You told everyone it was a miracle. But other times, most times, if we're being honest, nothing happened. The sickness didn't leave. The money didn't come. The situation didn't change. And when it didn't, you were given explanations. You were told that God said no, that His plan was bigger than your understanding, that He was teaching you patience or faith or surrender, that maybe you didn't have enough faith, that maybe there was unconfessed sin blocking your prayers, that maybe it just wasn't His will. And over time, you learned to accept that. You learned to surrender to the mystery of it. You learned to believe that prayer was ultimately unknowable, that you could never really be sure if your words were reaching God at all, that the whole thing was a matter of divine prerogative that you had no control over. Prayer became passive. It became a ritual you performed because that's what good Christians do. It became a monologue you delivered into the void, hoping someone was listening but never quite sure. You prayed at God, not with Him. You prayed to Him, not from Him. and the power that was supposed to be there, the power you read about in the Gospels, the power that raised the dead and opened blind eyes and multiplied bread and calmed storms, that power felt distant, inaccessible, reserved for Jesus alone because he was special, because he was the Son of God, because he had a divine nature you could never access. And here's the thing, none of that is technically wrong, but it's incomplete, devastatingly, intentionally incomplete, because what you were given was the outer shell of prayer, the words, the posture, the ritual. But what you were never given was the inner method, the technique, the doorway Jesus walked through before he spoke, the place he went to before power moved through him. And there's a reason you were never taught that. A reason the method was separated from the teaching. A reason it was moved behind locked doors and given only to those who had been initiated into deeper mysteries. Because if you knew how to do what Jesus did, if you understood that the power didn't come from begging God to change his mind, but from aligning yourself so completely with the source that you became the place where heaven and earth met, you wouldn't need the institution anymore. You wouldn't need priests to mediate your access to God. You wouldn't need bishops to interpret scripture for you. You wouldn't need the church to tell you whether your prayers were acceptable or whether you had enough faith. You'd be free. You'd be sovereign. You'd be dangerous. And so the method was removed. Not the words. Those stayed in your Bible. Not the stories. You still have all the miracle accounts. But the practice, the lived instruction, the step-by-step technique that made those words come alive, that was quietly moved into the monasteries, into the desert hermitages, into the mystery schools that existed on the margins of institutional Christianity. It was given to monks who spent decades in silent caves, to mystics who disappeared into the wilderness, to the occasional saint who stumbled into it through years of solitary devotion and somehow managed to leave breadcrumbs in their writings without getting burned at the stake for heresy. And even then, most of them couldn't explain it clearly. Because the method isn't intellectual. It's not something you can learn from a book or a sermon. It's experiential. It's a shift in consciousness.
It's a movement from the outer world of form and separation into the inner world of unity and presence. You can't teach that at scale. You can't systematize it. You can't turn it into a doctrine or a creed or a catechism lesson. And so, it was lost. Not completely. It never disappears entirely, but it was lost to the masses, lost to ordinary Christians, lost to you until now. Go back to the Gospels, not to worship them, not to memorize them, but to observe them, to study them the way a scientist studies data, Because if Jesus was using a method, if there was a technique behind the power, then it should show up consistently. It should leave a pattern, and it does. Every single time Jesus performed a miracle, something happened before the miracle. Something the gospel writers mention, but don't emphasize. Something they record but don't explain because they assume their readers already understood. Let me show you. When Jesus healed the paralytic in Mark chapter 2, the text says, "When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, 'Son, your sins are forgiven.' But look closer. Between a saw and a said, there's a gap. The gospel doesn't tell you what happened in that gap. It just moves past it. But something occurred. Jesus didn't immediately speak. He saw their faith, and then something shifted inside him, and then he spoke. When he fed the 5,000 in Matthew 14, he took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and the text says he looked up to heaven. That's all it says. He looked up, and then he blessed the food. And then it multiplied. But what happened in that looking? Where did his awareness go? What did he access in that moment before the impossible became possible? When he walked on water in Matthew 14, the gospel tells us that before he did it, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. He withdrew. He separated from the crowd and went into solitude. And the text says he was there alone in the dark praying. But praying how? Doing what? And then, after that time alone, he walked across the surface of a storm-tossed sea as though it were solid ground. When the woman with the issue of blood touched his garment in Luke 8, Jesus immediately knew. He felt power leave his body. He didn't decide to heal her. He didn't think about it. He didn't pray and ask God to heal her. The power moved automatically because he was already in a state where power could move. He was already aligned, already open, already living from the inner room. When he raised the widow's son at Nain in Luke 7, the text says he was moved with compassion, and then he touched the coffin, and then he spoke. But what happened between the compassion and the touch? What occurred in that space the gospel doesn't name? Because compassion alone doesn't raise the dead. Feeling sorry for someone doesn't reverse death. Something else happened. Something internal. Something that turned compassion into power. And then there's Lazarus, the moment I opened with. Jesus stands at the tomb. He's surrounded by mourners. He's face to face with the finality of death. And John 11:41 says, Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. Read that again. He thanked God in past tense. You have heard me. Not a please hear me. Not I'm asking you to hear me. He thanked God for already hearing him before anything had happened. Before Lazarus moved, before death released its grip, before there was any evidence in the physical world that anything had changed. That's not hope. That's not faith in the sense you were taught. That's certainty. That's knowing. That's speaking from a place where the future and the present have collapsed into one. Do you see the pattern yet? Before every miracle, Jesus withdrew. He went inward. He separated from the outer noise, the outer need, the outer desperation of the people around him. He entered a state of interior stillness, and from that state he spoke. Not as someone asking, not as someone hoping, but as someone who already knew the answer. As someone who had aligned so completely with the source of all power that there was no gap between his word and God's will. He didn't pray to God. He prayed from God. That's the difference. That's the method. That's what they never taught you. Matthew 6:6. Listen carefully. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Your whole life, you've probably heard this as advice about privacy. Find a quiet place. Don't be showy. Don't pray on street corners like the hypocrites. Pray alone where no one's watching. And sure, that's part of it. That's the surface meaning. But it's not what Jesus meant. Not fully. The Greek word Jesus used for a room is tamaion. It doesn't mean bedroom. It doesn't mean closet. It means inner chamber, treasury, storehouse, a hidden space inside something. Jesus isn't telling you to find a physical room. He's telling you to find the inner room, the interior space that exists within you, the place behind your thoughts, the silence beneath the noise of your mind, the stillness that's always there waiting, even when you're not aware of it. And then he says, I'll close the door. Not to try to focus, not to minimize distractions. Close the door. Zealot. Shut it completely. Shut out the world of the senses. Shut out the chatter of your thoughts. Shut out your identity, your history, your fears, your wants. Shut out the version of yourself that's anxious. That's lacking. That's separate from God. Because the Father doesn't live out there in the external world. He doesn't live in the future or the past. He doesn't live in your thoughts or your emotions. He lives in secret. In the inner room. In the place most people never go because they don't even know it exists. And Jesus went there every single time before a miracle occurred. That's not speculation. That's not poetry. That's pattern. That's method. Inward first. Door closed. Silence. Stillness, alignment, and then only then power. He withdrew from the crowd. He went up the mountain. He stepped away from the noise and the need, not because he didn't care, not because he was avoiding people, but because power doesn't come from the outer world. It comes from the inner room. It comes from the place of union, of coherence, of alignment with the source. And if you try to minister, to heal, to speak truth, to create change while you're still operating from your personality, from your fear, from your separated sense of self, you'll have nothing to give. Your words will be empty. Your prayers will bounce off the ceiling. You'll be speaking from the outside, and the outside has no power. But when you enter the inner room, when you close the door to everything that isn't God, when you rest in that silence until you and the Father are no longer two but one, then you speak from source. Then your word carries weight. Then reality responds, because you're not asking anymore. You're not hoping. You're recognizing what's already true. Now here's the question no one asks. If Jesus gave this instruction so clearly, why didn't anyone teach you how to actually do it? Why, in 2,000 years of Christianity, did this become a metaphor instead of a method? Why did it go into your room and close the door, turn into advice about finding a quiet place instead of an actual interior practice? What happened? Let me be very clear about something. The Bible wasn't falsified. The words of Jesus weren't changed. The scriptures you have are, for the most part, accurate transmissions of what was written down in the 1st and 2nd centuries. But here's what did happen. The early church, the one that existed before Constantine, before the councils, before Rome took over and turned a movement into an empire, they knew how to do this. They practiced it. They taught it. But they taught it carefully, quietly, in small communities where trust was everything. These weren't secrets kept out of arrogance or elitism. They were practices that required preparation. You couldn't teach someone how to enter the inner room if they hadn't first learned to be still. If they hadn't first learned to quiet, if they hadn't first developed the capacity to recognize the difference between thinking about God and actually encountering presence. The interior path requires maturity, readiness, a certain quality of attention that can't be forced or faked, and so the teaching was gradual. It was protected. It was given to those who demonstrated they were ready, not because they were more worthy, but because they had cultivated the inner conditions that allowed the practice to work. But when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, everything changed. Suddenly you had millions of people being baptized, entire cities converting overnight, and the institution needed order, structure, doctrine, something that could be taught at scale, something that didn't depend on years of interior development. And inner instruction doesn't survive that. You can't systematize silence. You can't standardize the inner room. You can't train priests to guide people into a place that the priests themselves may never have entered. And so the method, the lived practice, the actual technique, was gradually moved out of public teaching, not destroyed, not burned, just withheld, quietly reserved for those in monastic orders, for hermits in the desert. But the how, the step-by-step instruction, the interior technique that was moved into the margins. And over centuries, even those who held it began to forget. What remained were rituals. You could be a good Christian, attend Mass, take communion, recite the Nicene Creed, without ever once entering the inner room. And most people never did. So now you have millions of believers repeating the Lord's Prayer, bowing their heads, folding their hands, asking God for things. But they're doing it from the outside, from the mind, from the separated self, from the place of want and fear, and the door to the inner room stays closed. Not because God locked it, but because no one taught them how to open it. But here's the thing, it's not too late. The door is still there. The inner room still exists. Your soul has always known how to find it. You've just forgotten, and now you're starting to remember. Let me tell you the single most important thing I can tell you about prayer, the thing that changes everything once you understand it. Prayer isn't about persuasion. It's about coherence. Read that again. Let it sink in, because this is the hinge point. This is where everything you were taught breaks open and reveals what was always underneath. Prayer, the kind Jesus practiced, isn't about convincing God to do something. It's not about making your case. It's not about presenting evidence for why you deserve a miracle or why your situation is urgent enough to warrant divine intervention. God doesn't need to be convinced. God doesn't need to be persuaded. God doesn't change his mind based on how eloquently you ask or how desperately you plead. That entire framework is wrong. It's not just incomplete. It's fundamentally backwards. Because Jesus didn't pray to change God's mind. He prayed to align his own consciousness with what was already true. He entered a state where his will and the Father's will were no longer separate, where there was no gap, no division, no distance, just union. From that place of union, when he spoke, he wasn't hoping reality would change. He was recognizing that it already had. That in the realm of cause, in the invisible dimension where all form originates, the thing he was calling forth was already complete. That's why he spoke in past tense at Lazarus' tomb. That's why he thanked the Father before the miracle appeared. Because from inside the inner room, from the place of alignment, the future and the present collapse. Time bends. What you see with physical eyes hasn't caught up yet, but in the invisible it's already done. And so you speak from that knowing, not from want, not from hope, not from anxiety. You speak from certainty, from agreement, from the place where you and God are one. Listen to how Jesus said it in John 14:10. The words that I say to you I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does his works. He's not taking credit. He's not claiming personal power. He's saying, I'm not doing this. The Father is doing it through me. Not for me, not to me, through me. Meaning Jesus became the vessel, the doorway, the meeting place where heaven and earth touched, where the invisible became visible, where the formless took form. And he did that by entering the inner room and closing the door to everything that wasn't God, by letting go of his separate sense of self, by surrendering the illusion that he was doing anything on his own. From that place, he spoke. And when he spoke, the universe responded. Not because he was special, not because he had a divine nature you don't have, but because he had aligned completely. He had closed the door to separation. He was no longer speaking from the outside. He was speaking from source, and you can do the same thing. Not because I'm telling you to. Not because it sounds nice, but because you have the same inner room Jesus had, the same capacity for alignment, the same doorway to presence. You've just never been shown how to open it. Until now. So here's what I'm going to give you. Not the whole method. Not yet. Because if I gave you everything right now, you wouldn't value it. You'd try it once, decide it didn't work, and move on. The inner room doesn't open through information. It opens through practice, Through repetition. Through repetition. Through the patient cultivation of a quality of attention most people have never developed. So, I'm going to give you the entry point. The first step. The foundation without which nothing else works. If you want to go where Jesus went, you have to stop doing what you've been doing. Stop talking to God in your head. Stop asking. Stop wanting. Stop imagining him as someone separate from you, sitting somewhere out there in the sky, listening to your requests and deciding whether to grant them. Instead, do this. Sit. Somewhere quiet if you can, but it doesn't have to be perfectly silent. You don't need a monastery. You don't need incense or candles or special music. Just sit. Be still. Close your eyes. And instead of immediately launching into prayer, instead of starting to talk, just breathe. Not special breathing, not a technique. Just notice your breath. Feel it move in through your nose. Feel it fill your lungs. Feel it move out. Natural. Easy. Effortless. And with each exhale, let go of one layer of noise. Let go of the thoughts racing through your mind. Let go of the worries about tomorrow. Let go of the replays of yesterday. Let go of the voice in your head that's narrating everything, commenting on everything, judging everything. Just breathe and let go. As you do this, you'll start to notice something. Beneath the noise of your thoughts, beneath the constant chatter, there's a stillness, a silence, a presence that's always been there, waiting. It's subtle. You won't hear a voice. You won't see a vision. You won't feel lightning bolts or waves of ecstasy. But if you stay there, if you resist the urge to start performing prayer, to start asking for things, to start doing something, you'll begin to feel it. A presence, not external, not separate, closer than your own breath, closer than your own heartbeat. That's the edge of the inner room. And when you feel it, don't rush forward. Don't try to make something happen. Don't grab onto it or analyze it or try to figure out what it means. Just be there. That's all. Just be. Stay in that place. Even if it feels like nothing's happening. Even if your mind tries to pull you back into thinking, into planning, into the familiar pattern of asking God for things. Stay. Because the door doesn't open by force. It opens by recognition. And recognition takes time. You might sit there for 5 minutes and feel nothing. You might sit for 10 and think you're doing it wrong. But you're not. You're learning what Jesus learned. You're learning to be still, to close the door, to stop talking long enough to hear. You're learning what it feels like to not be the voice in your head, to not be the one who's afraid, to not be the one who needs something. You're learning to rest in presence, to return to the inner room, to remember that God was never out there waiting for you to get his attention. He's been here the whole time, closer than close, waiting for you to stop running long enough to notice. And that's the foundation, the first part, the beginning. Without this, nothing else works. You can learn every prayer technique in the world. You can memorize every scripture. You can fast and worship and serve and give. But if you never learn to enter the inner room, if you never learn to close the door and be still, you'll always be praying from the outside. And the outside has no power. Now, here's what I haven't told you. There's a second part to this. A deeper layer, something Jesus did after the stillness, after the silence, after he entered the inner room and closed the door. It's not a word. It's not a request. It's not even a thought. It's a shift, a movement of awareness that turned alignment into authority, that transformed the experience of presence into the ability to speak from source. It's the thing that allowed Jesus to say, "A Lazarus, come forth," and have death itself obey. It's the thing that allowed him to stand in front of a storm and say, "Peace, be still," and watch the wind collapse into calm. It's the thing that allowed him to touch a leper and watch disease flee, to look at a paralyzed man and watch his body rewire itself, to break bread and watch it multiply in his hands. It wasn't magic. It wasn't divine privilege. It was method. And it's the part that was most carefully guarded. The part that was only taught to those who had first mastered the stillness. The part that cannot be explained. Only experienced. Only experienced. Because it requires something of you. It requires you to let go of the last thing you're holding on to. The last illusion. The last separation. It requires you to stop being you. Not in some poetic sense. Not as a metaphor. But actually. To stop identifying with the small self. The personality. The one who wants things and fears things and needs things. To let that one dissolve. To close the door to it completely. And to discover what remains when you're not there anymore. That's when you stop speaking to God. And you start speaking as God. Not blasphemy. Not ego. But union. True union. The kind Jesus lived from every moment of his life after he emerged from the wilderness. And that part, that shift from presence to power, from stillness to authority, that's what I'm going to show you next. But only if you've done the work. Only if you've already begun sitting in the silence. Only if you've already felt for the edge of the inner room and tasted what it's like to stop being the voice in your head. Because the second part doesn't work without the first. And I'm not here to give methods to people who won't use them. I'm here for the ones who are ready, the ones who've been waiting their whole lives for someone to stop speaking in metaphors and start speaking in method. The ones who knew, deep down in their bones, that there was more to Jesus than what the church showed them, that the miracles weren't exceptions to natural law. They were demonstrations of a deeper law. A law you can learn, a law you can live from. You were right. There is more, and you're about to find it. So now you have a choice. You can close this video and go back to praying the way you've always prayed. You can keep bowing your head and folding your hands and talking into the silence, hoping God hears you, hoping He'll answer, hoping that maybe this time it'll be different. And that's fine. There's no judgment in that. That path has its place. But there's another option. You can do what Jesus did. You can stop talking long enough to go inward. You can find the inner room. You can close the door. You can learn to rest in the stillness until the stillness begins to reveal itself as presence. And then once you've found that place, once you've learned to return to it again and again, I'll show you the next part. The part that turns presence into power. The part that allows you to speak from source instead of to source. But you have to begin. You have to sit. You have to practice. Not once, not twice, but daily, faithfully, with the patience of someone who knows they're building something that will change everything. Because this isn't a quick fix. This isn't a hack. This is the way Jesus lived. This is what He spent 40 days in the wilderness discovering. This is what He returned to every morning before the crowds found Him. This is what He did before every miracle, every teaching, every moment of power. He went inward. He closed the door. He aligned, and then He spoke. And if you do the same, you'll discover what He discovered, that you were never separate from God, that the kingdom of heaven was never somewhere else, that the power you've been asking for was always inside you, waiting in the inner room, behind the door you never learned to open. So go, sit, breathe, be still, find the silence beneath your thoughts, feel for the presence that's always been there, rest in it, return to it, let it teach you what words never could. And when you've done that, when you've tasted the edge of the inner room and felt what it's like to stop being the one who asks and start being the one who aligns, come back, because there's more, so much more. And it's all waiting for you, but the door only opens from the inside. And only you can walk through it. What you've encountered here wasn't meant to in a single video. This is just the beginning. The first thread in something much larger. There are deeper writings waiting for you. Quiet reflections that guide you further into the inner room. Practices that help you return again and again to the place Jesus lived from. Not sermons, not arguments, not theology. Just instruction, method, the kind of guidance that helps you remember what your soul has always known. We call them the sacred scrolls. Each scroll carries a fragment of the original way, not the way of doctrine, but the way of practice, the way of going inward, closing the door, and discovering that God was never distant, never separate, never waiting for you to earn His attention. He's been here all along, closer than breath. Waiting in the secret place, in the inner room, in the silence you've been too afraid to enter. The scrolls exist for those who are ready to stop reading about prayer and start practicing it the way Jesus did. They're not written to convince you. They're not written to debate theology or prove anything. They're written to guide you, step by step, deeper and deeper into the place where words stop and presence begins. You'll find them in the description and the pinned comment below. And if you felt, while watching this, like you no longer quite fit in the old structures, if the traditional teachings feel too small now, too scripted, too distant from what you know is possible, you're not alone. We've created a quiet space for those who are learning to pray from the inner room. Not a community of believers trying to convince each other, but a gathering of practitioners. People who are actually doing the work, going inward, closing the door, aligning. It's not a place for debate. It's a place for practice, for walking together, for sharing what we're discovering as we learn to return to the silence again and again. If that calls to you, you'll find the doorway in the description and the pinned comment. There's no pressure, no rush. The inner room doesn't open on anyone's timeline but your own. Truth reveals itself when you're ready, not before, not after. And those who are meant to find this always do. So now, go inward, sit in the stillness, close the door to the noise, the wanting, the fear, breathe, and wait. The Father who sees in secret is already there. He's been there your whole life, waiting for you to stop asking and start remembering. Waiting for you to discover that you were never separate, that the kingdom was never somewhere else, that the power you've been praying for has been inside you all along. Now go find it.